Welcome back, my friend. The lamps are lit, the wind has quieted, and somewhere in the shadows the Niffler has found something shiny again. But this time, it's not gold. It's a story, and tonight, he's ready to share it with you. So settle in and listen closely. It begins like this.
King's Cross Station always smelled of coal, metal, and hurry. But on the 1st of September, as Tobias Ashford pushed his trolley through the crowd towards the barrier between platforms 9 and 10, he could sense something else, a faint taste of magic floating in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam. His mother walked beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, whilst his father carried the owl cage, a small tawny owl named Pepper, who was fluttering ceaselessly and swiveling her head in all directions, clearly displeased at being carted about in a cage like some common bird. Toby gripped the trolley handle tighter, and his free hand unconsciously reached for his pocket where his new wand lay. 9 inches, rowan wood, phoenix feather core. He had a habit of twirling things in his fingers when he was nervous. Pens, pencils, and now, it seemed, wands would have to be added to the list. His mother had already stopped him twice that morning when he'd unconsciously pulled out his wand and twirled it like a majorette with a baton. "Toby, darling, if you accidentally set the curtains on fire with a spell before you even reach the castle, it won't be the best start," she'd said, taking the wand and tucking it back into the pocket of his jeans. His heart was beating so loudly he felt certain it echoed through the entire station. 11 years he'd waited for this moment. 11 years he'd listened to his mother's stories about the castle with 1,000 windows, about moving staircases and ghosts that roamed the corridors. Now it was his turn. The barrier looked perfectly ordinary, just a brick wall between 2 platforms. His mother smiled gently. "Remember what to do?" she asked quietly. Toby nodded. They moved closer, and suddenly his mother placed her palm on his back and gave him a gentle push. He closed his eyes, braced himself, and walked through the barrier as easily as if it were made of mist. Platform 9 3/4 unfolded before him like the page of an open book. The scarlet steam engine stood by the platform, releasing white clouds of steam that crept towards the high arched ceiling. People were everywhere. Witches and wizards, students in ordinary clothes, parents bidding farewell to their children. Toby felt his chest fill with something warm and exhilarating. This was real. This was actually happening. His father emerged behind him with the cage, looking around with that particular wonder of a muggle seeing true magic for the first time in a long while. "Extraordinary," he murmured. "Every single time extraordinary." They helped Toby load his trunk and Pepper's cage into the carriage. His mother hugged him tightly, and he caught the familiar scent of her perfume, lavender and something slightly sharp. His father clapped him on the shoulder, smiling. "Write to us he said, "and ring when you can." Toby felt for his pocket where his Muggle smartphone lay, a gift for his 11th birthday. He knew that Muggle technology didn't work at Hogwarts, but his mother had assured him that students were allowed charm phones, a magical version enchanted for communication with family. He'd receive his once he arrived at the castle. One last goodbye, one last wave, and Toby stepped into the carriage. The doors closed behind him with a muffled thump. The corridor was narrow, filled with the smell of old velvet and something sweet. Perhaps someone had already opened a box of Bertie Bott's every flavor beans. Students hurried back and forth, searching for empty compartments, greeting old friends. Toby found an empty compartment near the end of the carriage. He hauled his trunk inside. It caught on the threshold and fell with a loud crash, nearly crushing his foot. Placed Pepper's cage on the rack above the seat, where the owl promptly turned her back to him in protest, and sank into the soft velvet seat by the window. Outside on the platform, his parents still stood waving. His mother held a handkerchief. Toby hoped she wasn't going to cry right there in front of everyone. And his father was saying something to her, his hand on her shoulder. Toby waved back, feeling a lump rise in his throat, not sad, but poignant. The train whistle shrilled sharply, steam billowed thicker, and the train lurched into motion. The platform slid backwards. His parents grew smaller, then disappeared entirely as the Hogwarts Express burst from the station into bright September sunshine. Toby watched through the window as London gave way to suburbs, then green fields and small villages. The landscape beyond the glass grew calmer, greener. The English countryside spread out beneath gray skies that occasionally broke with shafts of sunlight. The compartment door slid open, and a girl about his age peered in. She had fair hair pulled into a high ponytail and enormous glasses perched on her nose that constantly slid down, forcing her to push them back up with her index finger every 30 seconds. "Is this free?" she asked uncertainly, already having adjusted her glasses twice. Toby nodded, and she entered, dragging a trunk that seemed almost as large as she was. Behind her slipped a tall boy with dark hair and a slightly nervous smile. He immediately sat down and began drumming his fingers on his knee, quickly, rhythmically, as if playing an invisible drum. "I'm Emmy," said the girl, sitting opposite and adjusting her glasses once more. "Emmy Hartford, and this is Jacob. He always drums like that. Don't mind him." "I'm not drumming," Jacob protested, not stopping the drumming. "It's just, it helps me think." "About what?" Emmy asked. "About how if I mess something up at Hogwarts, my brother will never forgive me. He goes to Ilvermorny and keeps saying American magic is better than British magic." "Toby Ashford," said Toby, and his hand unconsciously reached for his pocket where the wand lay. He managed to stop himself just in time. They chatted briefly, more awkwardly than openly. Emmy was Muggle-born, and her whole family, she said, still couldn't believe magic was real. Her father, a dentist, had asked the professor who brought her letter whether magic could cure cavities. The professor hadn't known what to answer. Jacob was from a magical family, but his older brother attended Ilvermorny, so Hogwarts was a new experience for him, and a constant source of comparisons that always seemed to favor the American school. "They have thunderbirds that can control the weather," he said gloomily. "And what do we have? A ghost who teaches history of magic and doesn't notice everyone's asleep." Toby told them about Bath, about how his mother worked at the ministry, and his father was a Muggle architect who still tried to understand why the magical world didn't use blueprints. He says magical buildings have no logic. Mom replies that that's rather the point, Toby added, and Emmy giggled, adjusting her glasses again. Time passed slowly and quickly at once. Beyond the window, landscapes changed. The sun crept across the sky, leaving long shadows behind. Sometime after midday, a witch with a trolley looked in, and they bought several chocolate frogs and toffees. Toby unwrapped a chocolate frog carefully. It really did twitch and nearly leapt from his hands, to the great satisfaction of Pepper, who suddenly woke up and watched the frog with interest through the bars of her cage. Toby caught the frog and bit into it, feeling the chocolate melt on his tongue. Inside was a card with an image of Albus Dumbledore, who nodded to him gravely before walking out of frame, presumably to someone else's portrait. "I've got 3 Dumbledores already," said Emmy, looking at her card. "And not one McGonagall. It's not fair." "Maybe they're rarer," Jacob suggested, who had stopped his drumming only to eat a sweet. "Like legendary cards." "These are chocolate frogs, Jacob, not Pokémon," Emmy replied, but she smiled. Towards evening, the sky beyond the window began to darken. Students in the corridor grew noisier. Someone laughed loudly. Someone ran back and forth. And someone, judging by the sounds, tried to perform a spell and clearly botched it, because there was an explosion behind the wall and someone shouted, "It wasn't me!" Emmy and Jacob changed into their robes, and Toby retrieved his from the trunk. The black fabric was new, rather coarse, and smelled of cloth and dye. He put the robe on over his ordinary clothes, feeling slightly awkward. The sleeves were longer than necessary, and he had to roll them up, but at the same time, different, magical, or at least how he imagined magic. When the Hogwarts Express finally stopped, it was nearly completely dark. The station was small, barely lit by a few lanterns swaying in the wind. Students poured from the carriages, and Toby grabbed his trunk, barely keeping up with the crowd. The cold September air struck his face, and he smelled pine trees and damp earth. First years, this way!" The voice was thick and loud, like the rumble of distant thunder. Toby turned and saw an enormous figure, a man who towered over everyone else, with a thick beard and small but kind eyes. Hagrid. His mother had told him about him. "First years, follow me. No more than 4 to a boat." They walked along a narrow path that wound between the trees until they emerged at the lakeside. The water was black, smooth as a mirror, reflecting the first stars. Boats waited by the shore, small wooden vessels without oars, rocking gently on the water. Toby climbed into a boat with Emmy, Jacob, and another boy who introduced himself as Oliver. The boat swayed under their weight, and Toby gripped the edge, but the vessel steadied itself. Hagrid called out something, and the boats began gliding forward without any effort on their part. The lake was quiet, almost eerily quiet. Water lapped softly against the sides of the boats, and the only other sound was the students' heavy breathing and the distant rustle of wind in the treetops on the shore. Toby looked ahead to where the lake widened, and suddenly, there, around the bend, the castle appeared. Hogwarts. It towered on a cliff, lit by hundreds of windows glowing golden in the darkness. Towers reached towards the sky. Battlements stood out sharply against the starry sky. And the castle seemed so vast it could contain an entire world. Toby froze, forgetting even to breathe. It was beautiful, beautiful in a way that made him want to weep. The boats reached the foot of the cliff where there was a small dock, and students began clambering out, stumbling and helping one another. Hagrid led them through a narrow tunnel in the rock that led upwards to the castle. The walls were damp, smelling of moss and antiquity, and their footsteps echoed like heartbeats. Finally, they emerged into an enormous hall. The floor was stone, the ceiling high, and directly before them were massive oak doors. Hagrid knocked 3 times, and the doors swung open. The figure standing in the doorway was slender, dressed severely in emerald green robes. Professor McGonagall. Toby recognized her from descriptions. Her face was serious, but a warm spark glinted in her eyes as she surveyed the crowd of first years. "The first years, Professor McGonagall," said Hagrid. "Thank you, Hagrid." She led them into a small chamber off the main entrance. Toby looked around. The walls were decorated with portraits that shifted and whispered amongst themselves. His heart beat faster with each second. Professor McGonagall explained to them about the sorting ceremony, about the houses, about how their house would become their family for the next 7 years. Her voice was clear and commanding, but not cold. When she finished, she led them to the great hall. And if Toby had thought the castle impressive from outside, the great hall exceeded all his expectations. The ceiling was enchanted to show the sky, deep blue, studded with stars, with thin wisps of cloud drifting slowly past. 4 long tables stretched through the entire hall, filled with students who had returned for the new school year. Candles floated in the air, casting soft golden light on faces and plates. Toby could see the high table where the professors sat, and in the center, an empty chair where Dumbledore had once sat. On a small stool, directly before the high table, lay the sorting hat. It was old, crumpled, with patches, And when the first years drew closer, the hat suddenly opened a wide gap of a mouth and began to sing. The song was about the houses, about how each valued different qualities, about how together they all made Hogwarts great. Toby listened, barely breathing, and when the song ended, the great hall erupted with applause. Professor McGonagall produced a long scroll and began reading names. One by one, children approached the stool, sat down, and the hat descended upon their heads. Sometimes it decided quickly. Sometimes it deliberated. Emmy Hartford was sent to Ravenclaw, and she walked to her table smiling nervously. Jacob Murphy to Gryffindor. Ashford Tobias. Toby heard his name as if through water. His feet moved of their own accord. His hand reached again for his pocket, the habit, but he managed to stop himself. He approached the stool, sat down. The hat descended upon his head and, it must be said, was considerably larger than it had seemed from a distance. It slid down over his eyes, and for a moment Toby could see nothing but old, worn fabric. The voice was in his head, old, wise, slightly amused, and seemingly a bit weary after a good 100 first years already. Interesting, interesting. Half-blood from Bath. I see patience. I see loyalty. You want to belong, boy, don't you? Want to find your place. Not terribly ambitious. No, no. Slytherin's out. Not terribly brave, though that may come with time. But here, kindness, compassion, hard work. And this nervous habit of twirling your wand. You'll need to work on that, because sooner or later you'll accidentally transform someone into a polecat. Oh yes, I know where you belong. Though, wait, you're afraid of disappointing your parents, aren't you? This is Hufflepuff, or... no, definitely Hufflepuff. There, they'll teach you that being true to yourself is more important than meeting others' expectations. Hufflepuff! The hat shouted this final word aloud, and the great hall exploded with applause. When Toby removed the hat, he saw that the table at the end of the hall, the one closest to the enormous doors, was cheering and waving at him. He walked there, feeling his cheeks burn, and sat between two older students who clapped him on the back and welcomed him. Hufflepuff. He was a Hufflepuff. The sorting ceremony continued for some time. Toby watched as other first years received their houses, but most of the time he simply looked around, trying to remember everything. The faces, the candlelight, the smell of food that began appearing on the tables when the ceremony ended. The food appeared suddenly. Platters full of chicken, potatoes, vegetables, gravies, bread. Toby hadn't realized how hungry he was until he started eating. Around him, older students talked, laughed, told stories about summer holidays. Some asked him about himself, but most simply smiled kindly and continued their conversations. When the feast ended, the Hufflepuff prefect, a tall boy with curly hair, led the first years to their common room. They descended stairs, passed through corridors that grew cozier, with low ceilings and rounded doors. Finally, they stopped before barrels stacked against the wall. The prefect tapped one of the barrels in a particular rhythm, and suddenly one of them opened, revealing a round tunnel. They crawled inside, literally crawled, and emerged in the coziest room Toby had ever seen. The Hufflepuff common room was filled with warm golden light. Low, round ceiling, yellow armchairs and sofas, potted plants on every shelf. The fireplace crackled merrily in the corner, and the entire space smelled of something warm and sweet, perhaps honey or freshly baked bread. Windows looked out at ground level, and one could see grass and flowers beyond the glass. The prefect showed them the way to the dormitories. Toby climbed narrow stairs and entered a room where 5 four-poster beds stood. His belongings were already there, his trunk standing by one of the beds. He sat on the edge of the bed, and the springs creaked beneath him. The mattress was soft, the quilt thick and warm. The other boys in the room were also unpacking. One of them, a stocky boy with reddish hair, introduced himself as Charlie, and immediately told them that his greatest fear was spiders, that he adored Quidditch though he'd never flown on a broomstick, and that he had a cat at home named Sir Whiskers III. The first and second had been goldfish who, sadly, hadn't survived his early experiments with magic. Another, quiet and thin, Simon, said only hello, and immediately climbed into bed with a book, clearly having no desire whatsoever to talk about himself. There were also Michael, who had already hung up posters of the Chudley Cannons team and received a derisive snort from Charlie, and Daniel, who barely entered the room before falling asleep without even undressing. They talked briefly, everyone was tired, and then simply collapsed into their beds. Charlie was still muttering something about how tomorrow he'd definitely explore the castle and find the kitchens, because rumor had it you could always get extra food there. Simon turned another page of his book. Michael was already snoring. Toby lay under his quilt, staring at the canopy overhead. Around him, the other boys were falling asleep one by one. Beyond the window it was dark, and somewhere far off in the castle someone was laughing. The first week had begun, and Toby knew that ahead lay many, many more weeks, months, years. He fell asleep with a smile on his face. Morning came too soon. Toby woke to the sound of voices and footsteps in the corridor, and also to Charlie attempting to calm Sir Whiskers III, who had decided for some reason that 6 o'clock in the morning was the perfect time to hunt socks. "It's a cat, Charlie, not a tiger," Simon mumbled without opening his eyes. "Tell that to my sock," Charlie replied gloomily, displaying a sock with a large hole. For the first few seconds, Toby didn't know where he was, and then everything returned. The canopy overhead, the soft golden light filtering through the ground-level windows, the smell of earth and grass, and the fact that his hand was already lying on his wand beneath the pillow. He needed to break this habit. He dressed quickly, pulling on his robe over his ordinary clothes. Charlie was still searching for something in his trunk. Simon slowly sat on the edge of his bed, cleaning his glasses. Toby descended to the common room, where several students were already gathering. The prefect was handing out timetables, and Toby received his, a sheet of parchment with his lessons for the week written on it. First lesson, Transfiguration, with Professor McGonagall. They walked to the Great Hall for breakfast. Toby wasn't certain how to get there, but the older students led them, and he simply followed. The Great Hall in the morning was just as impressive as it had been in the evening. The ceiling showed the dawn sky, pale pink with gray clouds. The tables were laden with food: porridge, toast, eggs, bacon, fruit. The smell of freshly brewed tea and coffee filled the air. Toby sat at the Hufflepuff table and helped himself to porridge. He added some honey and berries, and the first spoonful was warm and sweet. Around him, students talked, splashed milk into tea, laughed at jokes. It was noisy, but good noisy, and Toby felt part of something larger. After breakfast, they went to Transfiguration. The classroom was on the second floor, and the journey there was an adventure in itself. Staircases moved, portraits talked to one another. A ghost in brass armor walked through the wall directly in front of them. Toby tried to remember everything, but it was all too fast, too much. Professor McGonagall was waiting for them in the classroom, sitting at her desk in the form of a cat. When all the first years had entered and sat down, she transformed back into a human with one fluid movement. Several students gasped, and Toby felt his own mouth fall open in amazement. The lesson was strict but fascinating. Professor McGonagall talked about the basics of Transfiguration, about how important it was to concentrate, about how this was one of the most difficult types of magic. They were given needles and had to try transforming them into matches. Toby tried again and again, but his needle remained a needle, though it occasionally glinted slightly. Charlie, sitting beside him, managed to make his needle emit a tiny wisp of smoke, but then it became a needle again, albeit now blackened. "Progress," said Professor McGonagall dryly as she passed. Michael fell asleep entirely, resting against his desk, and his needle simply lay there, completely unchanged, and perhaps slightly offended. Charms with Professor Flitwick were different. The small wizard stood on a pile of books so he could be seen better, and talked about the levitation charm, Wingardium Leviosa. His voice was squeaky but kind, and he demonstrated the spell himself, making a feather fly up and circle around the classroom. When it was the students' turn, most only managed to make their feathers twitch. Toby waved his wand, repeating the words, but his feather lay motionless. He tried again, concentrating harder, but instead of rising, the feather suddenly exploded. Quietly, but it exploded, turning into a small pile of ash. Professor Flitwick rushed over to him, his face expressing genuine curiosity. "Oh, that's Well, that's something new. Mr. Ashford, you weren't by any chance trying to incinerate the feather instead of lifting it? No, sir, Toby replied, feeling his face burn. I probably concentrated too hard. Interesting, muttered Professor Flitwick, making a note on his parchment. Overconcentration can lead to excessive magical flow. You'll need to work on, softness of execution. For now, here's a new feather for you. And please, imagine that you're simply asking it to fly, not ordering it under threat of death. Several students giggled, and Toby took the new feather, feeling like an idiot. Charlie, sitting beside him, patted him on the shoulder. At least you did something. My feather didn't even twitch, he said consolingly. Days formed into a rhythm. Rising, breakfast, lessons, lunch, more lessons, homework, dinner, time in the common room. Toby was getting used to the castle slowly. He learned to avoid the staircases on the third floor that liked to vanish at the most inopportune moment. He learned to greet the portraits, and some of them began responding to him. The fat friar, Hufflepuff's ghost, always smiled and asked how he was doing. Evenings in the common room, he unpacked his belongings, arranged books on the shelf by his bed, hung up a few photographs from home. Charlie turned out to be talkative, Simon, quiet but kind. They sat together by the fireplace doing homework, and from time to time Toby raised his head and looked around, barely believing that all this was real. Magical portraits were becoming familiar. He saw how a portrait changed when the person in it moved to another painting on a neighboring wall. Moving staircases, too. He learned to wait for them to return, or to find another route. Ghosts no longer frightened him. Sir Nicholas de Mimsy Porpington always bowed when Toby passed, and Moaning Myrtle, whom he accidentally encountered in the bathroom, simply sobbed and disappeared. The castle smelled of old stones, parchment, candle wax, and something indefinably magical. In the mornings, the corridors were cold, and breath turned to light mist. In the evenings, the fire in the common room crackled and warmed, and Toby sat in an armchair, feeling warmth slowly spread through his body. The 7th day at Hogwarts ended the same as the previous ones, with dinner in the great hall, homework by the fireplace, quiet conversations with his roommates. Toby lay in his bed, listening to the other boys fall asleep one by one. Beyond the window it was dark, and somewhere far off in the castle someone was laughing. The first week had ended, and Toby knew that ahead lay many, many more weeks, months, years. The castle no longer seemed alien. Corridors were becoming familiar. Portraits greeted him. Ghosts no longer surprised. He knew where his place was at the table in the great hall, where his bed was in the dormitory, how to reach the library without getting lost. He climbed the stairs to the dormitory where the other boys were already asleep. He undressed, climbed into bed, and pulled up the quilt. Beyond the window it was dark, and he could hear the quiet rustle of wind in the grass. He closed his eyes, and his last thought before sleep was that he was happy. The second week at Hogwarts began with a Monday morning that smelled of rain. Toby woke to the sound of water droplets tapping against the glass of the dormitory's round windows. The light was gray, soft, and for a moment he simply lay beneath the warm quilt, listening to the rain drumming outside. The castle seemed even cozier when there was foul weather beyond the windows. His hand, as always, lay on his wand. He'd brought it to bed with him the night before, despite Charlie telling him that it was a bit odd, Toby. A wand isn't a teddy bear. Charlie was already awake, searching for something in his trunk and muttering under his breath about Sir Whiskers III having nicked something again. Simon sat slowly on the edge of his bed, cleaning his glasses with the hem of his pajamas. Michael was still asleep, despite the fact that Daniel had already managed to dress and accidentally hit him on the head with his trunk. "Sorry," Daniel mumbled. Michael replied, not waking. Toby slid out of bed, feeling the cold of the stone floor through his socks, and dressed quickly. His robe no longer felt quite so strange. He was getting used to the weight of the fabric on his shoulders, to the way it rustled when he walked. In the common room it was warm, the fire burning merrily, though it was only September outside. Several older students already sat at tables reviewing their notes before first lessons. Toby took his bag, heavy with textbooks and parchment, and left with the other first years for the great hall. The rain had made the castle different. The corridors seemed darker, damper, and footsteps echoed louder on the stone floors. Portraits on the walls dozed or talked quietly to one another, and when Toby passed, a witch in a pink dress yawned and waved at him lazily. The great hall in the morning was filled with the smell of hot food, sharply contrasting with the cold of the corridors. The ceiling showed the same sky as outside, gray, heavy with clouds from which rain poured ceaselessly. But the rain didn't fall on the tables, stopping somewhere high above, and it looked peculiar to see the drops falling but not feel their touch. Toby sat at the Hufflepuff table and helped himself to porridge. He added honey and apples, and the warmth of the food spread through his chest. Beside him, Daniel, one of his roommates, was chewing toast and reading something in a textbook, preparing for some lesson. The older students were chattering about Quidditch. The first training sessions were to begin next week. After breakfast, they had herbology. They walked to the greenhouses in the rain, and even with hoods pulled up, Toby felt water trickling down his collar. But when they entered Greenhouse 1, warmth and moisture hit them in the face, and the rain outside seemed something distant. Professor Longbottom was waiting for them by the long tables covered with potted plants. He was young, younger than most of the other professors, and his face was kind, though one could see scars on it, barely visible in the light. He smiled when everyone entered. "Good morning. Please sit down." His voice was soft, without Professor McGonagall's severity or Flitwick's authority. He spoke simply, as if talking to friends. Toby sat at one of the tables with Charlie and several other first years from different houses. The lesson was about the simplest magical plants, Mimbulus Mimbletonia and mandrakes, though they didn't touch the latter, only looked at small seedlings. Professor Longbottom talked about each plant with such enthusiasm that his eyes shone. He showed them how to care for them properly, how to water them, what sort of soil they needed. His hands were skilled, covered in earth, and Toby could sense that this man truly loved what he did. At the end of the lesson, as students began gathering their things, Professor Longbottom detained them for another moment. "I know that for many of you all this is new," he said quietly. "Herbology may seem dull compared to Transfiguration or charms, but remember, plants are alive. They feel, they grow, and if you're kind to them, they'll respond in kind." He smiled, and something in his words touched Toby. He thought that this professor had probably seen a great deal. His mother had mentioned Neville Longbottom's name when she talked about the war. He'd been one of the heroes of the Battle of Hogwarts. History of magic was entirely different. Professor Binns, a ghost who floated through the blackboard without noticing, spoke in a monotonous voice about goblin rebellions. His words merged into one long drone, and Toby could barely keep his eyes open. Around him, students yawned, doodled in the margins of parchment, or openly dozed with their faces hidden behind textbooks. It was the only lesson where Toby truly struggled to stay awake. Astronomy, by contrast, was magical. They climbed to the highest tower of the castle at midnight on Wednesday, and though Toby was tired by the time he reached it, the view was worth it. The sky was clear, the rain had finished after lunch, and the stars shone so brightly it seemed one could reach out and touch them. Professor Sinistra, a witch with dark hair and a calm voice, showed them how to use telescopes, how to find constellations. Toby looked through the lens at Jupiter, a small bright point, and felt something rise in his chest. The universe was vast, and he was here, in a castle on a hill, gazing at the stars. The castle's rhythm was becoming his own rhythm, rising at 7 when the light was only just beginning to gray beyond the windows. A quick wash with cold water that finally woke him. Dressing in his robe, checking his bag. Was everything there? Had he forgotten a textbook, parchment, quill? Descending to the common room where others were already gathering, then up through corridors to the great hall. Breakfast was noisy and warm. Toby was getting used to sitting in the same spot at the Hufflepuff table, beside Charlie and Simon. Sometimes Emily, a third-year girl, joined them, always smiling and telling stories about what had happened in the castle the previous year. They ate quickly. Lessons began at 9, and then dispersed to classes. Lessons alternated: Transfiguration twice a week, charms 3 times, herbology, history of magic, potions on Friday. Each lesson was different. Each professor had their own style. Professor McGonagall was strict but fair. Professor Flitwick was enthusiastic and kind. Professor Slughorn, who taught potions, was cheerful and loved telling stories about his former students. Lunch was brief, an hour's break to eat sandwiches or soup to rest. Toby often simply sat in the common room, reviewing notes or just watching the fire in the grate. Sometimes they went outside if the weather allowed, and sat on the grass by the lake, watching the giant squid occasionally raise a tentacle from the water. After lunch, there were more lessons or free time, which Toby spent in the library or the common room. Homework was becoming more abundant. Essays for Professor Binns, practical assignments for Transfiguration, reading for herbology. Toby sat at a table in the common room, immersed in books, and time flew by unnoticed. Dinner was longer and more relaxed. Students sat at tables longer, chatting, laughing. Sometimes Professor McGonagall made announcements, or one of the older students announced a club meeting. After dinner, a bit more time for homework, then just rest. Toby loved these evenings when one could do nothing at all, just sit in an armchair by the fire, listening to others talk. On Thursday, he finally ventured to the library. It was enormous, room after room, full of shelves stretching to the ceiling. The smell of old books was thick, almost tangible, and Toby breathed it in deeply. It smelled of parchment, leather, dust, and something else, perhaps magic itself. Madame Pince sat at her desk by the entrance, watching everyone who entered like a hawk, or, more precisely, like a hawk who had survived 2 wars, 3 generations of students, and countless attempts to remove books without permission. She was thin, withered, and her eyes were sharp, very sharp. Toby suspected she could see through walls, and knew who was currently trying to hide a book under their robes at the other end of the library. When Toby approached her, she looked at him sternly. "First year?" He nodded. "No spells in the library. No food. No noise. If you damage a book, you'll pay. And don't think I won't see if you try to remove something without registering it. I see everything. Everything. Last week, I caught a boy trying to smuggle magical theory out under his hat. Under his hat. Understood?" Toby nodded again, now slightly frightened. Madame Pince leaned closer. "And if you're that first year who exploded a feather in charms, I'm warning you, there are no feathers here to explode. Only books. Old, valuable, irreplaceable books. Clear?" "Yes, ma'am," Toby whispered, feeling his ears burn. How had she already found out about the feather? She waved her hand, allowing him to go, and Toby quickly walked between the shelves, trying to become as inconspicuous as possible. He walked amongst the stacks, examining the spines of books. Some titles were familiar, from charms or transfiguration courses. Others were strange, peculiar. Theory of magical fields, alchemy for beginners, history of wands. By one of the shelves stood a small table with an enchanted tablet. Toby approached, touched the screen, and a menu appeared. One could search for books by title, author, subject. He typed Transfiguration Basic Level, and the tablet showed a list of books with indications of which shelf each was on. It was much simpler than searching manually. Toby found several books he'd been thinking about and sat at one of the tables by a window. The window looked out onto an inner courtyard, and he could see students crossing from one side of the castle to another. He opened the first book and began reading. The words were complex, many terms he didn't understand. But something about the process of reading was calming. The silence of the library, the rustle of pages, occasionally someone's quiet cough at a neighboring table. Saturday arrived like a gift. No lessons, no obligations, only free time. Toby woke later than usual and simply lay in bed, listening to the other boys in the room slowly waking. Outside, the sun was shining, the first truly sunny day in several days. After breakfast, a group of Hufflepuff first years decided to explore the castle grounds. There were 6 of them: Toby, Charlie, Simon, Michael, and 2 girls, Lily and Hannah. Lily was organized to the point of absurdity. She'd brought a notebook and pencil, not a quill, a pencil, because pencils are faster, and was writing down everything they saw. Hannah was her complete opposite. She stopped by every flower, every tree to admire them, and Lily had to keep going back to fetch her. Charlie commented on everything aloud. Simon walked silently behind everyone, and Michael was already complaining that he was cold, though they'd only been outside for literally 5 minutes. The air was fresh, smelling of grass and the lake. The sun warmed gently, without heat, and the sky was blue with occasional white clouds. They walked to the lake, where the water lay calm, reflecting the sky. The squid didn't show itself, but far off one could see ripples on the water. "They say something else lives there besides the squid," said Charlie, looking at the water. "Something old." "Mer people," Hannah replied. "My brother says he saw them during the second task of the Triwizard Tournament. They sing." They stood by the water a while longer, then walked to the greenhouses. Professor Longbottom wasn't there, but the door to Greenhouse 1 was open, and they peeked inside. The smell of earth and plants was thick, and something rustled somewhere in the corner. Simon nervously suggested moving on, and they went. The forbidden forest loomed at the edge of the grounds, dark and dense. The trees were ancient, their branches intertwining so thickly that almost no light penetrated inside. They didn't dare approach closely, but even from a distance the forest seemed alive, full of mysteries. Something roared softly somewhere inside, and Lily grabbed them and pulled them back. "It's dangerous there," she said. "My mom told me never to go in." They returned to the castle, tired but satisfied. Lunch was late, and they ate slowly, talking about everything they'd seen. Toby spent the rest of the day in the common room playing wizard chess with Charlie, a terrible game as he hadn't yet learned how to make the pieces obey. In the evening, he retrieved his charm phone. His mother had sent it via Professor Flitwick after that incident with the feather. Toby suspected the professor had deliberately mentioned it when delivering the phone with a small smile. Toby unpacked the small device with excitement. It looked like an ordinary smartphone, but the screen glowed with strange symbols that moved slowly. The instructions were simple. Press the home symbol, and it would automatically connect to his parents. He did so, and in a moment the screen lit up, showing his mother's face. She was smiling, and Toby saw she was sitting in the kitchen. Behind her, the wall with blue tiles he knew by heart. "Toby, how are you, darling? You haven't set the castle on fire yet?" Her voice was warm and slightly teasing, and Toby felt a sudden lump in his throat. "No, Mom, only one feather, but Professor Flitwick says it was progress." She laughed, that familiar laugh that always made him smile too. "Your father would like to hear about this? John, Toby's on." His father appeared on the screen, wiping his hands on a towel. He'd probably just finished washing up, his Saturday duty. "Toby, son, you look magical." "Dad, I'm just sitting in the common room." "Yes, but you're sitting in a magical common room. That makes a difference." They talked briefly. The connection was time-limited. He told them about lessons, about the common room, about how they'd explored the grounds today. His father's eyes shone with curiosity. "So, how does magic work?" he asked. "Have you figured it out yet? Are there any formulas? Do the laws of conservation of energy apply?" "Dad," his mother said patiently, "it's magic. It doesn't work according to your architectural principles. But there must be some logic." Toby laughed, and it felt so good to laugh with them, even through a screen, even from a distance. When the call ended, he felt simultaneously happy and a bit sad. Home seemed far away, but at the same time close. He placed the charm phone on the bedside table and sat down to write a letter by owl. Pepper was asleep in her cage, and he didn't want to wake her. But tomorrow he'd send the letter through the school owls. He wrote about the same things, about lessons, about friends, about the castle. Writing with a quill on parchment was unfamiliar. His handwriting came out crooked, and he smudged ink on his fingers several times. But when the letter was ready, he felt satisfied. On Sunday evening in the Hufflepuff common room, something special happened. The prefects organized a tea party, a tradition Toby hadn't yet known about. They brought teapots, cups, biscuits, and cakes, and all the house students, from first years to seventh years, gathered together. The common room was filled with warmth and light. The fire burned brightly. Candles glowed on the tables, and the smell of tea mingled with the scent of fresh baking. Students sat on the floor, on sofas, in armchairs, chatting, laughing. The prefect, a tall boy named Thomas, was telling some funny story about how, in his second year, he'd got lost in the castle and accidentally ended up in the bathroom on the 7th floor, where the ghost moaning Myrtle had mistaken him for someone else and pursued him for an hour. Toby sat on the floor by the fireplace, holding a cup of hot tea in his hands. Beside him sat Charlie and Simon, and they simply listened as the older students talked. It was cozy, almost familial. He felt part of something larger than just a group of students. Hufflepuff was family. When the tea party ended and students began dispersing to their rooms, Toby lingered a moment longer. He sat by the fireplace, gazing at the fire, and thought about the past week, about lessons, about the library, about the call home, about the tea party, about how quickly he was getting used to this place. The castle no longer seemed alien. Corridors were becoming familiar. Portraits greeted him. Ghosts no longer surprised. He knew where his place was at the table in the great hall, where his bed was in the dormitory, how to reach the library without getting lost. He climbed the stairs to the dormitory where the other boys were already asleep. He undressed, lay in bed, and pulled up the quilt. Beyond the window, it was dark, and he could hear the quiet rustle of wind in the grass. He closed his eyes and fell asleep with a smile on his face. The second week had ended. Ahead was another, and another, and another. But Toby was no longer afraid. He was ready. The third week at Hogwarts began with that particular silence that settles when something new ceases to be new and simply becomes life. Toby woke on Monday and, without opening his eyes, already knew where he was, felt the softness of the mattress beneath his back, heard Charlie's quiet breathing in the next bed, caught the faint aroma of honey that always seemed to hang in the air of the Hufflepuff dormitory. He no longer counted the days. Hogwarts had become his reality. The morning was cool. September was gradually changing its face, preparing for October. As Toby dressed, he noticed that the trees beyond the window had begun changing colors. Leaves that had been green just a week ago now had yellow and reddish tints at the edges. Autumn was coming slowly, almost imperceptibly, but inexorably. Breakfast in the great hall was the same as always, but Toby was no longer surprised by what he saw. He knew that porridge would be standing in the center of the table, that nearby would be jugs of cream and milk, that Charlie always took too much bacon, and Simon ate slowly whilst reading a textbook. This was routine, and there was something calming about this routine. Lessons, too, were becoming familiar. Transfiguration on Monday and Wednesday, charms on Tuesday and Thursday, herbology on Friday. Toby already knew where to sit to see the board, but not be in the front row under Professor McGonagall's watchful gaze. He knew that Professor Flitwick liked it when students asked questions, and that Professor Longbottom always gave extra points to those who were genuinely interested in plants. But familiarity didn't mean boredom. Each lesson still brought something new. In Transfiguration, they'd moved from needles to buttons, attempting to transform them into beetles. Toby couldn't manage it. His button only twitched slightly, as if trying to grow legs, but got stuck somewhere in the middle. Professor McGonagall passed his desk, glanced at the result, and nodded. "Progress, Mr. Ashford. Slow, but progress." It wasn't praise, but nor was it condemnation, and Toby felt slightly better. On Wednesday, they had their first potions lesson with practical work. Until now, Professor Slughorn had only talked about theory, about ingredients, about the importance of precision. But now cauldrons stood on their desks, and the air in the classroom was thick with vapors and smells. "Today we shall be brewing a cure for boils," announced Professor Slughorn, his voice cheerful, almost sing-song. "Very simple, very basic. But if you make a mistake, the result may be unpleasant." He showed them the instructions on the board, and Toby copied them onto his parchment, trying not to miss a single detail. 6 dried nettles, 4 horned slugs, juice of wild beet. Cook on a low flame, stir counterclockwise. When they began, Toby felt his hands trembling slightly. He tipped the nettles into the cauldron, and they hissed when they touched the water. Good. Added the horned slugs, they dissolved slowly, turning the liquid into something thick and gray. Also good. Beet juice. He poured too much. He realized it immediately. The potion turned not pale pink, but bright red, and began bubbling ominously. Toby felt panic rising in his chest. His hand, with that damned habit, reached for his wand in his pocket. No, not now. Beside him, Charlie had botched something. His cauldron began emitting thick green smoke, and Professor Slughorn rushed over, waving his wand and muttering under his breath. The smoke vanished, but Charlie looked crestfallen. Toby stared at his potion, which was becoming redder and redder. Perhaps if he stirred faster? He began stirring counterclockwise, 3 times, then 3 more. The color weakened slightly. Maybe it was working? He added a bit more water, just a little, and the potion began thickening again, but the color was becoming more correct. Pale pink, almost. When time was up, Professor Slughorn walked around the classroom, checking results. Most cauldrons had the wrong color, either too dark or too light. When he approached Toby, he looked into the cauldron and raised his eyebrows. "Oh, Mr. Ashford, this is almost right. A bit too thick, and the color isn't quite correct, but," he sniffed the potion, "but it would work. You corrected the mistake with the beet juice, yes? I see you added water. Clever. Not perfect, but clever. 3 points to Hufflepuff for resourcefulness." Toby felt the tension drain away. Not 5 points, as he'd hoped, but 3, and that was after he'd nearly ruined everything. He'd managed. Not perfectly, but he'd managed. The weather changed with each day. If at the beginning of the week it had still been sunny, by midweek the sky was overcast with clouds again. But this time the rains were different, not cold and harsh, but quiet, soft, autumnal. They fell at night, and Toby fell asleep to the gentle sound of drops on glass. In the mornings the air was fresh, smelling of damp earth and fallen leaves. The castle on such days seemed even cozier. Corridors were cool, and students walked faster, trying to reach warm classrooms or the great hall. But in the Hufflepuff common room it was always warm. The fire burned all day, and its crackling had become as natural to Toby as his own breathing. Evenings in the common room grew longer. After dinner, when homework was done, or at least set aside for later, students gathered by the fireplace. Older students loved telling stories about their adventures in the castle, about jokes they'd invented, about learning to fly on broomsticks or brew potions. One evening, when Toby sat on the floor by the fire with Charlie and Simon, an older student named Meredith began talking about the Battle of Hogwarts. Her voice was quiet, but everyone around fell silent, listening. "My older sister was here," she said, "in 7th year when it happened. She said the castle was full of Death Eaters, that they couldn't study properly. The Carrows, they tortured students for the smallest offense." Toby listened, holding his breath. He knew about the war. His mother had told him, though she didn't like talking about it in detail. But to hear it from someone whose family had been here was different. "But they fought back," Meredith continued. "Dumbledore's army, those who stayed. My sister says the most frightening thing wasn't the night of the battle itself, but before. Living in fear every day, not knowing if you'd see the sun tomorrow." She fell silent, staring into the fire, and no one dared say anything. Toby thought about Professor Longbottom, about Professor McGonagall, about all those who had been here that night. The castle remembered, the walls remembered. "But we won," said one of the older students, a tall boy sitting on the sofa. "And now we're here, and everything's different, better." Meredith nodded, smiling weakly. "Yes, now everything's different." On Thursday afternoon, a group of first years decided to visit Hagrid. Charlie had suggested it. He'd heard from older students that Hagrid was always pleased to have visitors, and that one could drink tea and hear fascinating stories about magical creatures. They walked to his hut after the last lesson, when the sun was already beginning to sink towards the horizon. The air was cool, and Toby pulled his robe tighter. The hut stood at the edge of the forbidden forest, small, with a chimney releasing a thin stream of smoke. Charlie knocked on the door, and in a moment it opened. Hagrid stood in the doorway, enormous, with a thick beard and eyes that shone with kindness. "Oh, first years! Come in, come in!" His voice was loud but warm. They entered, and Toby looked around the hut in surprise. Inside, it was cozy, though a bit chaotic. An enormous table occupied the center of the room, with cups, a jug, and a plate of biscuits on it. The fire burned, and beside it lay an enormous dog, Fang, whom Toby had seen from a distance during their walks. They sat at the table, and Hagrid poured them tea. The tea was strong, almost bitter, and the biscuits were tasty, though very hard indeed. Toby tried to bite off a piece and nearly broke a tooth. Charlie, sitting beside him, simply dunked his biscuit in tea and waited for it to soften, which seemed a far more sensible strategy. Hagrid talked about his work, about how he looked after the creatures in the forest, about the centaurs who could sometimes be seen at the forest's edge. Fang, the enormous dog by the fire, occasionally growled in his sleep, and Hannah flinched each time. "And you're learnin' well?" asked Hagrid, looking at them with interest. They nodded, talking about lessons. Charlie mentioned his transfiguration attempt, when his needle not only failed to transform into a match, but bent slightly, as if trying to escape. Simon quietly said that history of magic was the dullest lesson in the history of dull lessons. Lily mentioned she'd already read half the charms textbook ahead, at which Michael rolled his eyes so hard Toby thought they might get stuck. When Toby mentioned his nearly ruined potion and how he'd fixed the mistake, the giant smiled broadly. "Potions, tricky business. I was never much good at 'em myself. Once in third year, I accidentally added unicorn horn instead of bicorn horn, and me potion, well, let's say Professor didn't talk to me for 2 weeks. And then for another month, he looked at me like I'd personally insulted every unicorn in the world." They all laughed, and even Simon smiled. They talked a while longer, then said goodbye and walked back to the castle. The sun had nearly set, and the sky was painted in deep shades of orange and violet. Toby walked silently, thinking about the visit. Hagrid wasn't like the professors. He was simpler, more genuine, and his hut felt like a place where one could always find warmth. On Friday, in Charms, something happened that Toby had been waiting for 2 weeks. They were practicing Wingardium Leviosa again, and Professor Flitwick walked between rows, watching their attempts. Toby stood by his desk. The feather lay before him, and he raised his wand, repeating the movement they'd learned. Wingardium Leviosa. Nothing. The feather lay motionless. Wingardium Leviosa. Again, nothing. Toby felt disappointment creeping through his chest. Why did everyone else manage it and not him? He tried once more, concentrating harder. He imagined the feather rising, how light it was, how air could carry it. He swished his wand and spoke the words clearly. Wingardium Leviosa. And the feather twitched. Toby froze, not daring to breathe. Then it slowly, very slowly, began to rise. 1 inch, 2, 3. It floated in the air, barely perceptibly swaying. "Excellent, Mr. Ashford!" Professor Flitwick rushed over to him, his face beaming. "You see, you did it! Continue, maintain your concentration." Toby held his wand motionless, watching the feather floating before him. His heart beat so loudly he could hear it in his ears. It was working. He was doing magic. Real, actual magic. The feather descended after a few seconds when his concentration weakened, but it didn't matter. He'd done it. He'd managed. In the evenings, as homework became increasingly abundant, the Hufflepuff first years began gathering together to work on it by the fireplace. Toby sat at one of the low tables with Charlie, Simon, Lily, and Hannah. They shared textbooks, helped each other with essays, worked through confusing questions together. Why does Professor Binns think we're interested in how many goblins were in the Third Rebellion? Charlie complained, looking at his parchment in despair. Because it's history, Lily replied calmly, not looking up from her essay. And because he's a ghost and doesn't notice we're all asleep, Simon chuckled, and even Toby couldn't suppress a smile. They worked until late evening, and when they finally closed their books, silence already reigned in the castle. Students dispersed to their dormitories, and Toby lay in his bed, tired but content. Friendship was growing stronger with each day. They were no longer just classmates. They were a team, a group overcoming the difficulties of first year together. Charlie always had something funny to say. Simon was calm and clever. Lily was practical and organized. Hannah was kind and always ready to help. One evening, as they sat by the fire after finishing yet another essay for Professor Binns, Charlie suddenly asked, "Do you reckon we'll all stay friends? After Hogwarts, I mean." Lily looked at him in surprise. "Of course. Why wouldn't we?" "Well, I heard someone say school friends don't always stay friends, that people change." Hannah shook her head. "Maybe some people change, but we're Hufflepuffs. We're loyal. Remember what the hat said?" They all fell silent, thinking about this. Toby gazed into the fire, watching the flames dance. He thought about the years ahead, about everything they still had to experience together. And he wanted to believe Hannah was right, that they'd remain friends. "Yes," he said quietly, "we will." And in that moment, in the warmth of the common room, surrounded by people he'd only just begun to know, Toby believed it completely. The third week was ending, and when Toby lay down to sleep on Sunday evening, he felt that something had changed. Not in the castle, not in the lessons, in himself. He no longer felt like someone new, someone who was only just learning. He was a Hogwarts student. He was a Hufflepuff. He was part of something larger than himself. Beyond the window, leaves rustled. Wind whistled softly in the crevices. And somewhere far off in the castle, a clock chimed, counting the hours. Toby closed his eyes and fell asleep with a smile on his face. The fourth week arrived unnoticed, like a natural continuation of what had already become life. When Toby woke on Monday, the 22nd of September, he didn't feel that strange surprise that had accompanied the first mornings in the castle. Instead, there was something else, a deep, calm awareness of where he was, and that this place belonged to him just as much as he belonged to it. Outside it was cool. September was drawing to a close, and autumn no longer hid. It was everywhere. The leaves on the trees had turned golden, red, orange, and when the wind blew, they fell, swirling in the air before settling on the ground. Grass in the morning was covered with dew that glistened in the early sun, and the air smelled of firewood and something sharp, apples perhaps, or simply autumn. Toby dressed slowly, unhurried. Charlie was still asleep, wrapped in his quilt. Simon quietly gathered his things, preparing for the day. Michael and Daniel were talking in whispers about something, about Quidditch, it seemed, about how the first matches of the season were to take place in a few weeks. In the common room, light was already burning, though it was still half dark outside. The fire blazed, casting warm shadows on the yellow walls, and several students sat in armchairs, finishing breakfast or reviewing notes before morning lessons. Toby took his bag and left with the others for the great hall. Last Sunday had been the first when he hadn't felt nostalgic. Earlier, especially in the evenings when the castle grew quiet, he'd thought about home, about his room in Bath, about his parents, about familiar streets. But that Sunday, as he sat in the common room with a book in his hands, he suddenly realized he wasn't thinking about returning home, but about what he'd be doing tomorrow, about the Transfiguration lesson, about the essay for Professor Longbottom, about how Charlie had promised to show him a secret passage on the 4th floor. Hogwarts had become home, not instead of home in Bath, but alongside it. Another place where he belonged. The first lesson on Monday, Transfiguration, brought something new. Professor McGonagall announced that next week they'd have their first small test of knowledge. Not an exam, but a test of how well they'd absorbed the basic principles. The class began murmuring, and Toby felt his stomach clench with nerves. "It's nothing serious," said the professor, raising her hand to call for silence. "Simply a way to understand whether everyone is progressing at the right pace. But I advise you to review the material." The rest of the week, all the first years talked about the tests. They were to have tests in Transfiguration, Charms, and Herbology. Small ones, but still. Toby returned to his textbooks in the evenings, rereading chapters they'd already covered, trying to memorize terms, wand movements, rules. Charlie fretted aloud. Simon silently made additional notes. Lily compiled lists of what needed studying. But despite the nerves, Toby felt something else, confidence. He knew the material, perhaps not perfectly, but enough. He'd managed to brew a potion, make a feather levitate, almost transform a button into a beetle. He'd worked, and that work was bringing results. On Wednesday evening, as they sat in the common room immersed in books, the prefect Thomas entered with a smile on his face. "Attention, first years," he called out, and everyone looked up. "On Saturday evening, we'll have the traditional celebration for those who've completed their first month at Hogwarts. It's an old Hufflepuff tradition to mark that you've survived and become part of the house." He winked, and several older students laughed. Toby exchanged glances with Charlie, and both smiled. A celebration? That sounded good. The next days flew by quickly. The tests turned out not to be as frightening as they'd seemed. Professor McGonagall gave them a practical task: transform a match into a needle, and Toby managed it, though his needle was slightly crooked. Professor Flitwick tested levitation, and Toby's feather rose without problems, floating in the air for nearly a whole minute. Professor Longbottom asked questions about the plants they'd studied, and Toby answered most correctly. When the tests were over, he felt relief and satisfaction. He'd coped. Not perfectly, but he'd coped. Friday, the 27th of September, was special. The entire castle was preparing for the Autumn Harvest Festival, a tradition Toby had heard about from older students but hadn't yet witnessed. In the morning, when they came to the Great Hall for breakfast, it was already decorated. The ceiling showed a clear autumn sky, blue with white clouds, but enchanted leaves floated through the air, slowly descending, disappearing before they touched the tables. The walls were hung with garlands of oak and maple leaves, between which twinkled tiny lights like fireflies. On the tables stood baskets of apples, pears, grapes, and everything smelled of cinnamon and honey. Lunch that day was a feast. The tables groaned with food: apple and pumpkin pies, roast chicken, herbed potatoes, fresh bread still warm, root vegetable soups, autumn harvest salads. Desserts appeared after the main courses: cakes, muffins, puddings, all decorated with sugar leaves and edible flowers. Toby ate slowly, savoring every morsel. Around him, students chatted, laughed, and the great hall was filled with warmth and joy. The professors at the high table smiled too, and even Professor McGonagall looked relaxed, talking with Professor Flitwick about something that made them both laugh. After lunch, many students went outside. The weather was sunny, though cool. Toby went with Charlie, Simon, Lily, and Hannah to the lake. They sat on the grass, watching the water lap quietly against the shore, and simply talked about nothing in particular: about lessons, about the celebration that evening, about how quickly the month had passed. "Feels like it was only yesterday we were riding the Hogwarts Express," said Hannah thoughtfully, hugging her knees. "And a whole month has already gone by." "Yeah," Simon agreed quietly. "Time flies fast here." Charlie tossed a pebble into the water, and it skipped twice before sinking. "To me, it feels like I've always been here. Like I remember home, but it feels distant." Toby understood what he meant. Home in Bath was real, but Hogwarts was here, now, and it filled every moment of his life so completely that everything else receded into the background. In the evening, when darkness fell, they returned to the common room, where the prefects were already preparing the celebration. The common room was decorated the same as the Great Hall: garlands of leaves, tiny lights, baskets of fruit and sweets. The table was laden with tea, hot chocolate, biscuits, cakes. When all the first years had gathered, the head of house, Professor Cedric Vale, head of Hufflepuff and teacher of magical history and ethics, entered the room. He smiled warmly, and everyone fell silent. "Welcome, first years," he said, and his voice was warm but solemn. "You've completed your first month at Hogwarts, and that is an achievement. I know that for many of you it has been difficult. A new place, new people, new challenges. But you've coped, and now you are part of the Hufflepuff family." He looked round at everyone present, and his eyes were sincere. Hufflepuff is not simply a house, it is home. A place where each of you matters, where your efforts are valued, where you can be yourself. Remember this always. And remember that you are never alone. We are all here for one another. He raised a cup of tea. To you, to Hufflepuff, to home. "To home!" everyone repeated, and the room erupted with applause. The celebration continued until late evening. Students ate, drank, talked. Older students told stories, gave advice, shared their experiences. The prefects organized several games, and Toby played magical charades, laughing so hard his stomach ached. When it was all over, and most students had already dispersed to their dormitories, Toby remained by the fireplace with Charlie, Simon, Lily, and Hannah. They sat on the floor, leaning against sofas, and simply watched the fire. "A month," said Charlie quietly. "Only a month, and it feels like I've known you lot forever." Lily smiled. "That's because we're going through everything together. When you're with someone every day, all day, you quickly become close." "I'm glad I was sorted into Hufflepuff," said Simon, who rarely spoke about his feelings. "At first I thought I wanted Ravenclaw, but now I can't imagine myself anywhere else." Hannah nodded. "Me too. It's the right place." Toby looked at them, at the faces that had become so familiar, at the people who in a month had become his friends, and he realized that right now, in this moment, he was completely happy. "We've changed," he said quietly. "In this month, we're not the same as we were on the platform." They fell silent, thinking about this. Lily slowly nodded. "Yes, we've changed, but for the better, I think." They sat a while longer, then slowly dispersed. Toby climbed the stairs to the dormitory, but before going to bed, he sat at the small desk by his bed and retrieved parchment and quill. He wrote a letter home, not via charm phone this time, but the old-fashioned way, with quill on parchment. He wanted his parents to be able to hold his words in their hands, for his mother to be able to keep this letter if she wished. Writing was unfamiliar. His handwriting came out crooked. He smudged ink on his fingers several times, and once accidentally dropped a spot of ink in the middle of the word professor, turning it into an illegible blotch. But when the letter was ready, he felt satisfied. "Dear Mum and Dad, a month has passed since I came to Hogwarts. It's hard to believe so little time has gone by. It feels like I've been here much longer, or perhaps it feels like I've always been here. Sorry about the ink blot. My wand was lying on the desk, and I accidentally knocked it when I reached for the quill. Yes, Mum, I know you said to keep my wand in my pocket and not twirl it about. Working on it. I want to tell you that everything's fine. More than fine. It's wonderful here. Hufflepuff is the right place for me. The Sorting Hat said I was loyal and wanted to belong. It was right. I've found friends, and they're good people. Charlie makes me laugh every day, and his cat, Sir Whiskers III, steals socks. Simon always helps with homework, though he's so quiet that sometimes I forget he's in the room until he suddenly says something clever. Lily keeps us all organized and has lists for everything, including a list of her lists. Hannah is the kindest person I've ever met and stops to admire every flower. Michael mostly complains and loves Quidditch, but he's good too. Lessons are hard but interesting. I'm still not very good at Transfiguration. My needle refuses to become a match. I accidentally exploded a feather in charms. Professor Flitwick says it's because of overconcentration, but I think I just don't understand how magic works yet. I nearly ruined a potion, but managed to fix the mistake and got 3 points. Dad, magic doesn't work according to physical laws. I tried asking Professor Flitwick about conservation of energy, and he just laughed and said, "Magic is an exception, Mr. Ashford." Sorry. Today was the Autumn Harvest Festival, and the Great Hall was so beautiful. And this evening we had a celebration for Hufflepuff first years. Professor Vale, he's our head of house, said we're now part of the family. And I feel it. I feel that I belong here. I miss you. I miss home, miss Bath, miss our Sunday walks to the Roman baths. But I'm happy here. I know it sounds strange to miss and at the same time be happy elsewhere, but it's true. Hogwarts is home. Not instead of our home, but alongside it. I have 2 homes now. And that's the best feeling in the world. I'll write again soon. Give my love to everyone. And tell Pepper that Sir Whiskers III is no competition. She's still the best owl. With love, Toby. P.S. Mom, I'm not twirling my wand anymore. Almost never. Promise. He folded the letter, sealed it with wax, and decided to send it tomorrow through the school owls. Pepper was asleep in her cage, and he didn't want to wake her. Toby lay in bed, pulled up the quilt, and stared at the canopy overhead. Around him, the other boys were already falling asleep. Charlie's quiet breathing was audible, rustling as Simon turned over. Distant footsteps in the corridor. Beyond the window it was dark, and he heard the wind whistling softly, carrying fallen leaves with it. Somewhere in the castle a clock chimed. 12 times. Midnight. September was ending. The first month at Hogwarts was ending. Toby closed his eyes and felt warmth slowly envelop him. He thought about everything that had happened in this month, about the journey on the Hogwarts Express, about the sorting ceremony, about the first night in the common room, about lessons, about failures and successes, about fears and joys, about the friends he'd found, about the professors who taught him, about the castle that had become his home. He thought about how 6 years still lay ahead. 6 years in this place. 6 years of magic, learning, growing. 6 years in Hufflepuff, amongst people who valued loyalty, hard work, kindness. He thought about how he was no longer afraid. He knew where he was. He knew who he was. He was Tobias Ashford, first-year Hufflepuff, student of Hogwarts. He was part of something larger than himself. He was home. Sleep came slowly, gently, like a warm blanket. And when Toby finally fell asleep, there was a smile on his face, quiet, peaceful, happy. The first month at Hogwarts had ended, but this was only the beginning of something wonderful.